Howdy, all. This is Kyle Whittington, and I am coming to you today on this Memorial Day 2024. And I just wanted to talk about some things that are, I guess, near and dear to me as a veteran and as somebody who's seen a thing or two. And I just wanted to share some things, and most in particular, the story of Father Emil Kapaun. I thought it was pronounced Kapaun, but I've been listening to stories from people who actually were with him, including like the POWs that survived the encounter, and they all pronounce it Kapaun. So despite it looking like Kapaun, it's yeah. Um, so I just want to go over a little bit of a military tradition. With it being Memorial Day, I totally didn't get this before the video started. Thankfully, the microphone is attached to my shirt, so I can just keep talking, avoid the dead air. Thank God I cleaned up the stuff behind me. But there's a little bit of a military tradition. So what you'll see is, they'll grab a beer and you say cheers, and then you'll usually see the guy tap the tap his drink on the table or some surface before he drinks it. That tap is just a little bit of a just a nod to the fallen. So today, in particular, we're going to remember Father Emil Kapaun, excuse me, and we will just kind of tell their story a little bit and go forward. Now, just another, I guess, some Memorial Day traditions. It's not very customary to say Happy Memorial Day. And on this day in particular, we always, we remember the fallen. So just like you wouldn't tell a widow Happy Anniversary on, the date of her husband's death, you also are not going to say Happy Memorial Day. That being said, most veterans that I know are gracious enough to where they're not going to, start yelling at you or whatever. We understand that, like, you don't mean anything by it. But hey, the more you know. Anyway, so let's talk about Father Emil Kapaun for Emil Kapaun. I'm so sorry. I'm probably going to pronounce his name differently each time, but let's talk about him a little bit. So, born in 1916 in Kansas, he was baptized in the same church that his parents were married in, and then he eventually became pastor of that church. He was a chaplain in World War II, and then he separated, and then he later got he went back into service, back into the chaplain corps whenever the Korean War started. Now, for those of you who know anything about the Korean War, it's not a happy time. That was a I mean, technically, it never ended. We've got North and South Korea separated by the 38th parallel. There's, the DMZ in between there. But yeah. So anyway, uh, initially, we were kind of caught unprepared. The North Koreans kind of swept through. The communists came through, and they kind of just ran through the country. We were not prepared. The South Koreans were not prepared, etc. Anyway, we pushed them all the way back once the more forces arrived. And then, it seemed like, haha, well, looks like we won. Well, then that's whenever the Chinese forces started coming in further from the north, and were kind of reinforcing the communist forces of the North Koreans. So there's this town called Unsan. It's actually in present day North Korea, and it was a group of about 600 to 1,000 US soldiers, and they were attacked by about 10 to 20,000 Chinese communist forces. Big battle ensues. A lot of the soldiers were telling Father Capen, you have to get out of here, because, as I'm sure most of you know, as a chaplain, you're not allowed to carry a weapon. Chaplains and medical personnel are a protected class. They are non-combatants, so they don't carry weapons, and they're also not legal targets. The only way that you can kill a chaplain legally per the Geneva Convention is by collateral damage. So you drop a bomb on a military target. If the chaplain's there, if he dies, well, that's not a war crime. But you're not allowed to take aim and fire at a chaplain or a medic. So anyway, these guys are probably sitting there thinking well, you don't have a gun. you're not going to be much good. We're outnumbered over 10-1. Father, you got to get out of here. Go. But he refused in saying, no, my place is with the wounded and the dying. So the battle starts, and he starts, every time he hears the gunshots, he starts running toward the gunshots because that's where the wounded are going to be. That's where his job is going to be. And he kept going through. He actually, at one point, rescues a Chinese officer who speaks English. And through that, he was able to kind of negotiate a surrender, because that was the only way that these guys were going to survive, because there was just no escaping from this. And then there's another, so they kind of do that. But then there's another instance where Herb Miller, which I believe, at least as of like 2021, he was still alive. I don't know if he's still with us. He was also a World War II vet, and now he's in Korea. He has a gun barrel about 2 inches away from his face, and he's about to die. He's wounded, and this Chinese soldier is about to finish him off. And Father Kapaun comes up and just pushes him out of the way and helps Herb Miller up. And Herb says, he said in this interview that's on the, like, if you go to like the Father Kapaun website, you can listen to the whole interview. He said, well, I just knew that we were both about to die, because obviously Herb's injured, Father Kapaun's unarmed, so this is it. But then he said, there's just the look on the Chinese soldier's face was just completely flabbergasted. He was astonished at what had just happened, and for whatever reason, he didn't fire. Well, now starts the death march. Oh, and actually, so for that little episode right there, that was what Father Kapaun was awarded his Congressional Medal of Honor for. Once again, pretty sure most of you know this, but the Congressional Medal of Honor is normally is the highest military award that the U.S. military can give out to a military member, and it is extraordinarily difficult to receive, and it's just for exceptional acts of heroism and bravery. And it's also even more rare that somebody will survive their encounter with, that thing, receiving one, basically. So a lot of them are awarded posthumously, and which actually, so this is why, Father Kapaun being awarded the Medal of Honor under the Obama administration is, but having died in the 1950s. So yeah, it took that long. So, okay. So now begins the death march. Now, I heard a whole bunch of different miles, distances that this death march was. I've heard anywhere from 40 to 100 miles they had to march, and a lot of them were injured, a lot of them were starving, and this was just a lot of them were ill. And the way these death marches work is, you got to remember that the Chinese have no like Christian sentiment about them. So they're not going to be giving the same treatment to an enemy as maybe like a Christian nation would. So if we, in World War II, when we were fighting Germany, we could actually expect much better treatment between soldiers. Now, obviously a different story in the concentration camps, but and we see that in World War II as well, with just when you shoot down a plane and the pilot is parachuting down in the Western Front, it was very much widely agreed upon that you did not shoot parachuting pilots. However, in the Pacific theater, that there was no such custom. They would 100% gun down a parachuting pilot, even though. So you see some similarities as well in the Bataan Death March. Who actually, my grandfather's first cousin, Otto Whittington, was a part of that. And actually, there's a book written about it. It's Extraordinary Lives, Ordinary People. That might be flipped around. I don't know. If you Google Otto Whittington, you can find it. Anyway, the death march begins, and whenever somebody would fall behind and couldn't march, well, the enemy soldiers, the communist soldiers, had no intention of carrying these men. So they would just have like some guys in the back, and they would just shoot them in the ground and then just keep going. So Father Capon is already carrying Herb Miller, the guy that he had saved, and he's encouraging these other guys to pick them up and carry them so that way as many of them can make it to where they're going alive. And one of the other soldiers that survived said that no matter what happened, they never saw Father Capon take a break on carrying his man. So he walked all whatever 40 to 100 miles without taking a break. He was always carrying his man. So all right, so obviously they get to the prisoner of war camp, and this is not a happy time. They get starvation rations, and it was 500 grams of millet. I don't know if it would. Millet is basically bird seed. So if you've ever seen any of that, it's obviously not a lot. So they would try to boil it up as best they can, and then even shortly after getting the 500 grams, it's then reduced to 450 grams, even more to just starve these guys out. Now, so the men are obviously getting sick and they're dying. Beriberi starts being contracted amongst some of the men, and Father Capon, being the as a father, he treats himself as the father of all of these men, and he just decides that he's going to take care of absolutely everybody there. So, Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim, it didn't matter. Everybody in that camp knew him as father, and that's exactly how he treated them. There's another survivor says that it was Father Capon that convinced him of the power of prayer, because it was Father Capon that would go out and would steal food for everybody else. And so he would escape the camp, steal food, and smuggle it back in and make sure that the men had more to eat. And then he would also do these, excuse me, he would do these, um, he would do these morale boosting things. Like in the morning, he would just boil hot water, and he would say, "All right, fresh coffee, get your hot coffee in the morning." And he would give just a little bit of this hot water. And obviously, it wasn't coffee, but it was something. And even though it was just hot water, it would be just enough to raise the spirits of the men, just to help them get through the day. And then there's another story of how um, they wanted to get rid of Father Capon because the communist soldiers correctly identified him as the man that was keeping the morale from being broken. And they got into some sort of argument, whatever. And one of the soldiers thought that he was going to stand up for Father Capon and try to argue with the guard, and he was beaten. And afterwards, Father Capon kind of chastised him a little bit, and he said, um, hey, afterwards, father went up to him and he said, "It is not your job to suffer for me. Like that's not what this is for. Like I would gladly suffer anything for you, but don't do the same for me." Because as this father was going through this, he, obviously he's a celibate. He doesn't have a wife and children at home. He wanted to make sure that his men were taken care of. Now, eventually, Father Capon contracts pneumonia, and this is going to be what ultimately kills him. So, and they're thinking, oh, now's our chance to get rid of this guy. So he sends it to the hospital, which wasn't at all what it was. The Chinese, they called it a hospital, but nobody ever came out of it again. It was a death house. So what they would do is they would starve the men in there to death, and of course they would never come out again. I, it's really interesting. I don't know why they would do that. Why not just shoot him? Unless they were afraid of being accused of war crimes, whatever. I don't know. That's an interesting thing that you always hear in these stories of these men, like having some sort of legal framework that they have to operate around. Whatever. So let me see if I can pull up the quote here, because it's absolutely gorgeous. Um, he said, as he was they were carting him away, one of Mike Dow was just weeping and saying like, "No, Father, I don't want you to go." And he says, "Don't cry for me. I'm going to where I'd always wanted to go. And when I get there, I'll say a prayer for each of you." And that's just so incredibly beautiful. Obviously, eventually, these men were uh, they were rescued. They were able to go home, and they tried. They wanted to the men wanted to celebrate some sort of like memorial service for him in the camp, and the Chinese, they denied it. They said, "No, you can't do that," because even though he was dead, they knew that the power of his spirit, the God was still with them, and they wouldn't allow that to continue to live on because they were scared of it. So, yeah, fast forward a few years, the men are liberated, they get to come home. In 1993, he's declared a servant of God. So his cause for canonization is open right now. And so what does that mean? Well, obviously, I just told you the story. You can think of how he exhibited the theological virtues of, faith, hope, and love. And he always kept the faith. He held out hope. When he was sitting in the camp, you'd often be able to. Uh, they say you'd see him just kind of staring and smiling at the road, and they said, "What are you doing, Father?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm thinking about that glorious day when an American tank drives up that road just to liberate us all." So he never lost his hope. Even whenever they were carting him out to his death, he was like, "Listen, I'm going to heaven. I'm getting out of here, guys. So don't cry for me. This is kind of a happy day. I always wanted to go to heaven." So, and then obviously the love that he had for these men with very little regard to his own life was just remarkable. So obviously, you got the theological virtues that he's exhibited very clearly in his life. Obviously, there's like a Father Capon Society, which was really cool because in 2021 they found his body. Um, After he was killed, some soldiers were told, "Hey, he's dead. Go bury him." And they just barely did. But whenever part of the negotiation for the release of the prisoners was also the release of the remains, and those remains were transported to Hawaii, and they were able to find his body. And whenever they were able to bring his body back, I believe it was in 2022, they actually finally got to hold a funeral mass for him with his remains present. And he's currently entombed in, I probably should have looked this up, but it's some church in Wichita, Kansas. So it's absolutely remarkable. Um, Servant of God, what does that mean? Well, that means that you can ask for his intercession. You can pray for his cause for canonization. You can ask for his intercession for miracles, because that's what it takes to get this process to move forward. Obviously, he's not a martyr. To be a martyr, it has to be um, what is it, in ira fide, something like that, out of hatred of the faith, and that's not what this was. This was an act of war, so he can't be considered a martyr. So it'll take literal miracles to move forward. So you can pray for those miracles either in your own life or the lives of others, and yeah, move that forward. But I just think that that's really cool, especially in this day and age where it's really easy to think really down on on the military, really down. I mean, and maybe I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, because as an Air Force veteran, I did go to Afghanistan. It was kind of the only significant thing that I did in my entire military career, and it wasn't for that long, and I didn't do much. Any service members here, who, especially Army, would recognize me as what they call a FOBIT, so forward operating base, a FOB. A fobbit was somebody that never left the base, and that was me. Most combat that I saw was when I was playing Call of Duty. So obviously, I'm not trying to put myself up with the guys that were like really in the thickness of battle, but still, we got what they'd call indirect fire, and statistically, it's safer than driving in downtown St. Louis, but obviously, there's still a modicum of danger. And yet, so we did that. And while I didn't know anybody directly that died while we were over there was I met this chief warrant officer. He was a C-12 pilot, and a C-12 is just like a small cargo plane. It's like a Beechcraft, twin engine, etc. But he was a C-12 pilot, and on Christmas Day, he saw that I was sitting alone and eating by myself. And even though he'd never met me, he was a chief warrant officer. I was an airman first class. That's an E3, 2 steps away from being the lowest ranking guy in the military. And he came and he came and ate with me, and he just had some general, just really nice questions. I called him chief, but he introduced himself to me by his first name, which I've since forgotten, and I kind of feel bad for. And I don't know, it was just a really nice thing as I was eating, my Christmas meal by myself. And anyway, I got to learn a little bit about him. Well, later on, he we get what's called an in-flight emergency, an IFE, and we kind of have these. I don't want to say regularly, but they're not fun, and they could be anything from landing gears not coming down to a hung bomb, which is where like the impulse carts ignite, but the bomb doesn't actually come off the rack, and that creates a nerve-wracking situation because well, that bomb's got to come down one way or another, and we don't know how on it actually is. So that's an in-flight emergency. There might be some. I don't know. The pilot might just be having a maintenance issue that needs to be taken care of urgently, regardless, whatever. When there's an in-flight emergency, it kind of goes out to everybody though. So we're sitting in the shop and I hear it go over the radio that there's an IFE, and there was just something in the tone of the voice of the person that was announcing it said, this one's different. And from what I understand, even the helicopters, they normally would still like go on the runway and they would still take off as if they were a plane. I guess that makes it easier for the air traffic controllers if everybody's doing the same thing. No such thing happened this. So we actually had the HH-60s, the Pavlos, the helicopters that were right next to our unit. And whenever that helicopter took off, it like just made a beeline straight out of the base. No runway stuff. It didn't taxi, whatever. It took off right where it was and started heading out, presumably filled with PJs, the pararescuemen from the Air Force. So, oh, thanks, Julia. So Father Capon is entombed in the Immaculate Conception in Wichita, Kansas. So if you're ever in the area, go visit. Anyway, so as this helicopter is leaving, we find out that a C-12 had crashed, and my mind immediately went to this chief warrant officer that had shared a meal with me. Now, spoiler alert, it wasn't him. He wasn't on this plane. But I find out that they go find this wreckage, and there's no survivors. I believe there was 6 casualties aboard, and it's just tough because those 6 men died, and for what? It's I didn't know these guys, but I know for a fact that this pilot that shared this meal with me, he knew them. He was from Hawaii. The guys that died were part of the Hawaii National Guard, and yeah, I don't know. So it's frustrating that like these acts of heroism, while they're good and inspiring and it's just frustrating whenever all of this just seemingly goes to waste, like, what did we even do there? So, yeah. Um, but anyway, that was my little presentation. I'm trying to get better at being able to do these kind of more off the cuff things. Uh, so, if anybody has any questions, let me know. I can see there's only 3 of you watching right now. But yeah, so I guess if you stuck around this long, my recommendation to you for today, for Memorial Day, is absolutely pray for the repose of the souls of those who have fallen in combat, American, European, or otherwise. It doesn't matter. Um, War sucks, and even the communist soldiers, that lost their lives in this conflict, you know, obviously our Lord desires that all be saved. So, for what little hope there is for their salvation, we should absolutely be praying for the repose of their souls. If you have anybody in your family, anybody anybody your friends know that are um, uh, that have passed away in the line of duty, pray for the repose of their souls. Pray for them by name. And because these wounds, they run deep, obviously, like, losing a loved one's never easy. And oh, one more story. This is so we've already talked about my military service and kind of already hit the highlights of it, quite frankly. But there was one time I got the opportunity to hold the Air Force flag in a Memorial Day parade at a Renaissance fair. Now, I was holding the flag and marching. It was kind of silly. Um, and because I mean, here I am in my blues, and like everybody else is dressed up at like they're at a Ren fair. And as we're marching through the streets of this place, whatever, I can hear the guy behind me is a complete blubbering mess. And I guess Memorial Day never really hit me until like that. And so anyway, I'm very curious to see what's going on, but just keep my military bearing, just keep, straight faced, eyes forward, don't be looking around. Just focus on doing your job, and my job was carrying the Air Force flag with dignity. Um and so afterwards, one of the actors, whatever, gives some speech, and I turn around and I see the guy who is this blubbering mess, and it's this man carrying an urn. And I don't know this guy. I just kind of heard the story, you know, through others, and this guy was carrying the remains of his son who went to Iraq but didn't come home. And today is the day that we remember these guys, not the guys like me who, you know, went downrange for a little bit and got paid a lot of money to do so, or even the guys that just got to come home. It's for those that didn't. And yeah, so after we did that, we all went back into like this bar or whatever, and all the military guys were kind of hanging out there. And the guy who was kind of leading the whole thing, who was, had this big bushy beard, was wearing a kilt, like built solid muscle, whatever. And he gets a beer for everybody. And of course, he's just completely in tears. And I think he was a former Army Ranger. And he said, and let that be a reminder to all of you that there's no such thing as a happy Memorial Day. So, um, yeah. So that's about all I have. Um, there's plenty of stories that are out there. I'd love to, if you guys have any stories that you'd like to share that are uh, that you'd like to share, feel free to share them in the comments. I will read every single one of them, I promise. And yeah, and And if anybody, any trolls here, which trolls don't make it 30 minutes into a video, if you want to criticize me, move it to a different video, please. Because this is a little, I don't know, this was a little personal, and so just go attack me somewhere else, please. Anyway, so on that note, um, servant of God, Father Emil Kapaun, pray for us, and dear Lord, just yeah, sorry, I'm not good at publicly praying, so I'm going to end this now, and I'm going to go pray for a little bit. So, all right, later, guys.